The wind over Red Mesa carried dust and whispers that didn't belong to 1885. I was fixing the south fence of my ranch when the horizon tore open like paper, bleeding light so bright it burned the edges of the sky. The cattle bawled and stampeded away from the glow. My first thought was wildfire. My second, well, there was no word for it. The thing that landed didn't belong to our world. Its metal skin shimmered in colors I'd never seen, and when it hit the ground, the earth trembled like it feared what had just arrived. Curiosity is a curse in the West, but I grabbed my Winchester and rode toward it. Inside the twisted wreck, I found her, shackled, bruised, and with eyes that shifted colors like storm clouds. She didn't speak my language, but her fear was human enough. I cut her free. She clung to me like I was the only thing keeping her alive. That's when the sky screamed again. Shapes emerged from the rift, tall, armored, carrying weapons that hummed like angry wasps. They weren't here to save her. And if I had to guess, they weren't planning to leave witnesses either. Dustwater was a quiet place before that day, a ranch town too small to have trouble and too far from the railroad to matter. Folks here knew me as Caleb Ward, the man who kept to himself, fixed his fences, and didn't stir the pot. But trouble has a way of finding you, even if it has to cross galaxies. The girl, no, the being, was weak, barely standing. I carried her to my barn, hiding her under the sweet smell of hay. Her wrists bore strange burns where the shackles had been. When she tried to speak, her voice was like music played backwards, foreign, haunting, and desperate. That night I realized I wasn't just sheltering a runaway. I was standing between her and whatever monsters had crossed the stars to get her back. My life was about to be worth less than a broken spur. If you want to know how a simple rancher ended up facing enemies from another world and what I had to sacrifice to keep her safe, stick with me. This ain't just a story about gunfights and cattle drives. It's about a love I never expected, one that might cost me everything. I didn't sleep that night. The barn smelled of dust and sweat, but underneath it was something sharper, like the tang of lightning after a storm. She lay on a bed of hay, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, the strange light in her eyes dimming as exhaustion took over. I sat on a stool, Winchester across my knees, ears tuned to every sound outside. Dustwater was quiet, but out in the desert, coyotes weren't the only things that hunted in the dark. I kept replaying the moment I cut her chains, the way she looked at me, not like a stranger, but like she already knew me, or needed me for something I couldn't yet understand. At dawn, I stepped outside to fetch water from the pump, but the horizon looked wrong. Out past the buttes, a shimmer danced in the air like heat waves, except the morning was cool and crisp. My gut told me it was the same tear in the sky I'd seen the day before, only now it was smaller, closing. If her captors had come through it once, they could come again, and the next time, they might not miss my ranch. The pump handle creaked as I worked it, the sound too loud in the morning stillness. Every crow in the cottonwoods seemed to have taken flight, as if they'd heard the same warning I felt in my bones. When I returned, she was awake. She sat up slowly, her hands gripping the blanket like it was the only solid thing in the world. Her gaze locked on mine, and in it I saw both gratitude and terror. She spoke. 3 words, maybe 4, in that melodic, backward-sounding language. I shook my head, trying to tell her I didn't understand, but she reached for my hand, pressing it to the side of her face. Her skin was warmer than it should have been, almost feverish, but her touch sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Before I could speak, the ground quivered. It wasn't much, just a subtle vibration like a distant stampede, but it made the horses in the corral whinny and rear. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the barn doors, scanning the open plain. That's when I saw it, a glint of metal catching the morning sun, moving low across the desert. Too smooth for a wagon, too fast for any rider I knew. The air around it shimmered like water, distorting the sagebrush. My first thought was they'd found her. My second was that they were coming for me next. I told her to stay put, though I doubted she understood a word, and stepped out into the yard. The object moved closer, and now I could see it wasn't just one, but three. Small crafts, each the size of a coffin, hovering a few feet above the ground. They moved in perfect formation, no dust kicking up from their passage. When they stopped 100 yards away, the front panel slid open, revealing figures inside, tall, armored, faceless. Their weapons glowed faintly, the same angry yellow as the tear in the sky. I didn't wait for them to speak. In the West, you don't give a man, or whatever they were, the first shot. I raised my Winchester and fired. The crack echoed off the hills, and the round hit the lead figure square in the chest. It staggered back, but didn't fall. Instead, its armor hissed, sealing the dent like it was breathing. Then they moved, fast, too fast, spreading out in a pincer pattern. I fired again, hit nothing. The third shot bought me enough time to dive behind the trough. Beams of light sizzled past, turning wood to ash where they struck. The barn door burst open behind me, and she was there, not hiding, standing. Her eyes blazed brighter now, almost painful to look at. She raised her hand toward the nearest attacker, and for a moment, the air between them warped like the sky had when I first saw her. The figure froze mid-step, armor sparking. Then, with a sound like glass shattering, it collapsed into a heap of black shards. I stared, my mind trying to catch up with what I'd just seen. She looked at me, breathing hard, and I realized whatever power she had was burning her up from the inside. I grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the house. We made it to the porch just as another beam tore through one of the corral posts, sending splinters into the air. My hat flew off, the brim smoking where the light had grazed it. She stumbled, and I lifted her into my arms, kicking the front door open. Inside, I set her down by the table and shoved the heavy oak cabinet in front of the window. My heart was hammering, not just from the fight, but from the weight of the choice I'd already made. There was no going back. They weren't going to stop. I could see them through the crack in the curtains, moving methodically, searching for an opening. The rifle felt small in my hands now, almost laughable against their weapons. Still, I'd be damned before I let them take her again. She reached for something at her neck, a small metallic disc that had been hidden under her shirt. She pressed it into my palm, curling my fingers around it. Her voice was faint, but insistent. Whatever this thing was, it was important enough to give to a man she'd just met. The vibrations grew stronger, rattling the glasses in the cupboard. Outside, the air shimmered again, and a thin line of light split the horizon. The tear was opening wider, its edges bleeding colors that had no names. I realized this wasn't just about her anymore. If that rift stayed open, God only knew what else might come through. The West had its dangers, outlaws, drought, famine. But this was something our world had no law against and no way to fight. And that's when I decided if they wanted her, they'd have to go through me. And if that meant riding straight into a storm from another world, then so be it. The pounding in my chest didn't slow as I loaded the last 2 rounds into the Winchester. The barn was no longer safe, and the house was a trap waiting to happen. I knew the terrain around my ranch better than anyone, but I also knew these things didn't play by the same rules as a man on horseback. The shimmer in the distance was growing brighter, pulling my eyes like a bad omen. I'd seen lightning storms on the open plains, but this looked like the sky itself was splitting under some invisible weight. The alien woman, God help me, I still didn't know her name, sat slumped against the wall, eyes half closed, but still watching me like she trusted me to have a plan. Truth was, I didn't. I grabbed my saddlebag from the peg by the door and started stuffing it with what little mattered: water canteen, jerky, spare ammunition, the revolver I kept under the floorboard. The rifle would slow me down in close quarters, but I couldn't leave it behind. When I turned to her, she seemed to understand what I meant without a word. She pulled herself up, swaying but standing, and stepped closer. Her fingers brushed mine briefly as I helped her into my old leather duster. It hung loose on her frame, but the sight of her in it, like she belonged here, hit me harder than I expected. No time for that. I jerked my head toward the back door, and we slipped into the early light. The plan, if you could call it that, was to reach the gulch north of my property. The sandstone walls there could give us cover, and if we made it far enough, the river bend might hide our tracks. But I hadn't counted on the way these things moved. The hum of their weapons carried on the wind, a steady, unnatural drone that made my teeth ache. Twice I thought I saw one of them flicker in and out of sight, as if stepping between shadows that didn't belong. She caught my arm once, pointing to a ridge, her voice urgent though I still couldn't understand her words. We altered course without hesitation, my gut telling me she knew more about our hunters than I ever could. We were almost to the gulch when the first shot came, not a bullet, but a beam of golden light that turned the mesquite tree ahead into a heap of smoldering ash. I pulled her down behind a boulder, my shoulder slamming hard into the rock. Another beam hissed past, close enough to singe the hair on my arm. I peeked over the edge and spotted them, 3 shapes cresting the hill, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. They moved with precision, weapons raised, fanning out to box us in. I fired twice, the rifle's recoil jolting through my bones. One of them staggered, its weapon sputtering, but the other 2 pressed forward. She moved before I could stop her. Rising from cover, she extended both hands toward the attackers. The air shimmered again, like heat above a forge, and the ground beneath their feet cracked open in a jagged line. One of them fell hard, its armor sparking wildly, as if something inside had been shorted. The third fired, but the beam bent, mid-air, curving harmlessly into the sky. My jaw went slack. Whatever power she carried, it wasn't just defense, it was control. She swayed, and I caught her before she hit the ground, her skin burning hot like she'd just run a fever through her entire body. We didn't wait to see if they'd get back up. I hauled her onto the saddle, swung up behind her, and spurred the gelding into a dead run. The gulch swallowed us a minute later, the walls closing in on both sides, cutting off the view of the rift. My breathing matched the horse's labored rhythm, each stride taking us farther from the ranch and deeper into territory I'd only ridden when hunting strays. The shadows here were deep, the silence heavier. Even the wind seemed to hesitate before entering. But I knew better than to trust quiet. It was often the prelude to something worse. We reached the river bend, just as the sun climbed higher. I slid off the saddle and led the horse into the water, the cool rush over my boots a welcome relief. She followed without hesitation, her gaze scanning the cliffs above, like she expected an ambush. Maybe she did. I caught my reflection in the rippling surface. Dust-streaked face, jaw tight, eyes older than they had been yesterday. There was no turning back. This wasn't just about helping a stranger anymore. It was about protecting whatever chance we had to keep our world ours. We stopped in a shaded alcove to rest. She leaned against the rock, her breathing uneven, and for the first time I noticed faint markings on her skin, lines of light that pulsed faintly, tracing patterns down her arms. They seemed to respond when I touched her wrist, the glow intensifying before fading again. She didn't pull away. Instead, she said something soft, almost musical. I wished I could tell her I understood. I wished even more I could tell her everything was going to be fine. But lies have a short life out here, and I wasn't about to start feeding her false hope. A sound broke the stillness, a low, thrumming vibration from deeper in the gulch. My hand went to the revolver, the weight of it suddenly feeling inadequate. She stiffened beside me, her gaze locking on the shadows ahead, and then they stepped out. Not the armored figures this time, but something taller, leaner, its body shifting like smoke trapped in glass. Its eyes, or what passed for them, burned with the same strange light as the rift. It didn't carry a weapon, because it was the weapon. I raised the revolver anyway. My father always said a man's worth wasn't in the fight he won, but in the fight he didn't walk away from. Out here, that was gospel. She moved to stand beside me, her shoulders squared despite the tremor in her hands. Whatever this thing was, she'd seen it before and feared it. The thrumming grew louder, the air thick with an energy that made my skin crawl. My finger tightened on the trigger. In that moment, I knew the fight for Dustwater, and maybe more than Dustwater, had just begun. The creature moved like smoke in the wind, yet every step it took made the ground under my boots tremble. Its shape never stayed still, arms elongating, torso narrowing, head tilting in ways that made my stomach twist. I'd faced outlaws, bounty hunters, and drunk ranch hands with itchy trigger fingers, but this thing, it was something born in a place where fear was part of the air. My revolver felt like a toy, but I raised it anyway, because in the West, you meet trouble standing. The alien woman's hand brushed my sleeve, her grip tight enough to tell me she didn't want me firing unless I had to. But the way this thing was closing in, it felt like we were already past that point. The thrumming in the gulch deepened, vibrating in my teeth and bones, until I realized it wasn't just coming from the creature, it was coming from the walls themselves. Lines of faint light were crawling along the sandstone, etching strange patterns that reminded me of the marks I'd seen glowing on her skin. The thing's eyes flared, and a sharp crack split the air, followed by a gust of wind strong enough to rip my hat away and send it tumbling into the river. I squinted against the force, keeping my stance wide, and when the gust died, I fired. The bullet passed through its chest like smoke through a screen, hitting the rock behind with a dull thunk. It didn't flinch. Her voice cut through the ringing in my ears, urgent and melodic, like she was reciting a command. She stepped forward, both palms facing the creature, and the marks on her arms blazed to life. The air between them warped, the way desert heat distorts the horizon, and then suddenly the thing recoiled. Its form flickered, splitting into jagged shards of light before reassembling. She stumbled, and I caught her, the heat from her skin making me grit my teeth. Whatever she was doing, it was hurting her as much as it was hurting it. I dragged her behind a jut of rock, my mind racing for a plan that didn't involve us dying here in the middle of nowhere. The creature didn't wait. It slid over the rocks like water, its body narrowing to fit the space. I drew my Winchester from its scabbard and jammed a fresh round into the chamber. This time, I aimed for the head, or what I thought was the head, and pulled the trigger. The report echoed in the gulch, and for a split second its form twisted violently, scattering sparks like fireflies in a jar. That was the first time I heard it make a sound, not a roar, but a low, grinding tone that scraped the back of my skull. It didn't retreat, but it slowed, circling instead of rushing. Predators do that when they've found something worth taking their time with. She pressed the metallic disc she'd given me earlier back into my hand, her eyes locking with mine. This time, she spoke slower, enunciating each strange syllable. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the urgency. The disc was warm, almost pulsing, and when I looked down, faint symbols shimmered across its surface. They were the same as the ones glowing on her skin, and something told me this wasn't just a trinket, it was a weapon, or a key, maybe both. She guided my fingers to a shallow indentation on its edge and nodded once. When I pressed it, the world changed. The air thickened, the sunlight dimmed, and the walls of the gulch seemed to stretch upward like they were being pulled into the sky. A sound like 1,000 wings filled the space, and the creature froze mid-step, its form unraveling at the edges. But the effect didn't last long. It surged forward again, this time faster, its body solidifying. I raised the Winchester one more time, but before I could fire, she stepped in front of me, holding both her hands over the disc. The pulse of light that erupted from it was blinding, painting the gulch in white fire. When my vision cleared, the creature was gone. Not dead, just gone, like it had been pulled backward through the air into nothing. The markings on her skin faded, and she collapsed into my arms. I lowered us both to the ground, her breath shallow but steady. My own lungs felt raw, like I'd been holding my breath for hours. I didn't know if we'd won or just bought ourselves a little time. The gulch was silent again, but it wasn't the kind of silence you trusted. Somewhere, far off, the shimmer of the rift still stained the horizon. We rested there for a while, long enough for the sun to crawl higher and turn the sandstone walls into sheets of gold. I kept watch, my eyes scanning for movement, but the only thing I saw was a hawk circling lazily overhead. She stirred once, murmuring something in that haunting language of hers. I wished I could ask her the questions burning in my chest: where she came from, who was after her, why she'd chosen my ranch of all places to fall into. But right now, survival came first. Talking could wait until we were somewhere they couldn't track us. Eventually, she stood on her own again, though her steps were unsteady. I led her out of the gulch and toward the high ridge overlooking the northern plains. From up there, you could see all the way to the distant mountains, and more importantly, you could see if trouble was coming. Trouble was coming. 3 of the coffin-like crafts were cutting across the desert, moving fast, heading straight for Dustwater. If they reached town, folks wouldn't stand a chance, not against weapons like theirs. My fists clenched around the disc in my hand. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the only home I'd ever known. We needed horses, ammunition, and allies. Dustwater had the first 2, maybe the third if I could convince the right people. But riding back into town meant risking every man, woman, and child there. My gut churned at the thought. Still, there was no other way. I looked at her, standing there in my old duster, the morning wind tugging at her hair. She nodded once, like she'd already read my decision in my face. I swung into the saddle, pulled her up behind me, and turned toward the trail. One way or another, Dustwater was about to see a kind of fight it had never imagined. The ride back to Dustwater felt longer than the trail had any right to be. My gelding's hooves struck the hardpan in a steady rhythm, each beat pounding home the thought that we might be riding straight into a slaughter. She stayed pressed against my back, silent, but I could feel her eyes scanning every rise and ridge like a hawk hunting for movement. The wind carried a faint hum, distant but growing. I knew it wasn't the railroad. Dustwater didn't have one. That sound belonged to something not made in this world. I adjusted my grip on the reins and told myself that maybe, just maybe, we'd get there in time. Dustwater came into view like it always did. Low buildings scattered along the main street, the saloon's swinging doors catching the light, and the water tower standing guard over it all. Only now there was movement where there shouldn't be. Folks were out in the street, pointing toward the northern desert. I followed their gaze and saw 3 shimmering dots closing in fast. The same coffin-shaped crafts I'd seen from the ridge. I reined in at the edge of town, and every face turned toward us. The stares shifted quickly from recognition to suspicion when they saw her sitting behind me. Sheriff Cobb was the first to speak, stepping out from the boardwalk with his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "Ward," he said, "what in hell's name have you brought into my town?" I swung down, helping her to the ground before facing him. "Trouble," I said. "The kind you've never seen before. Those things out there, when they hit, they won't care who they kill." He glanced at her, then back at me. "And she's the reason they're coming?" His tone made it clear it wasn't a question. "She's the reason they're here," I corrected, "and maybe the reason we've got a chance to survive." Cobb spat in the dust and shook his head. "You always did have a knack for bringing storms with you." He turned to the growing crowd. "All right, folks, listen up. We've got maybe 10 minutes before those things are on top of us. Get the women and children to the cellar under the saloon. The rest of you, if you can shoot, grab your guns. If you can't, grab water and keep low." The townspeople scattered, some moving fast, others still throwing wary glances at her. She kept close to me, her eyes darting to every unfamiliar face, probably wondering if they'd be allies or another threat. We set up along Main Street, using barrels, troughs, and overturned wagons as cover. I found myself between Cobb and Old Man Avery, who'd brought out his battered scattergun from the war. "Ward," Avery said, You sure this ain't some fool story? I don't fancy dying over something I can't understand. I didn't look at him. Don't need to understand it, I said. Just shoot when they get close enough, and don't stop until I tell you. The hum in the air grew louder, and with it came a faint vibration underfoot. She knelt beside me, pulling the metallic disc from my duster pocket. Her fingers danced over its surface, symbols flaring to life. The first craft appeared over the rooftops, skimming just above the buildings. The crowd gasped, and a few folks fired too early, the bullets sparking harmlessly off the hull. Cobb barked at them to hold. The craft slowed, hovering in the center of the street. The side panels slid open, and out stepped two armored figures, weapons glowing in the morning light. The moment their boots hit the dirt, all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from every side, the sharp cracks of Colts and Winchesters mixing with the deep boom of Avery's scattergun. Beams of golden light cut through the dust, punching holes clean through anything they touched. One of the beams struck the water tower's base, and with a groan, the whole thing tipped. Water exploded into the street, knocking men off their feet and soaking the powder in their rifles. The alien woman stood, ignoring the chaos, and held the disc high. A pulse of light rippled out, catching one of the armored figures mid-stride. It froze, then collapsed like it had been drained of life. The other turned its weapon on her, but I stepped in front, firing until the Winchester's magazine clicked empty. The rounds didn't drop it, but they slowed it enough for Cobb to land a shot that sent it staggering backward into the side of the saloon. The second craft banked low over the rooftops, and I realized we were just seeing the start. This wasn't a raid. It was an extraction. They wanted her, and they'd burn dust water to the ground to get her. She knelt again, pressing the disc to the dirt. The ground trembled, and a ring of light burst outward, knocking the second craft off course. It slammed into the general store, the impact sending a shockwave through the street. I grabbed her arm and pulled her into cover just as debris rained down. My ears rang, my lungs burned, but I was still breathing. When the dust cleared, the third craft was hovering at the far end of the street, its panels sliding open. This time, it wasn't soldiers that stepped out. It was something taller, leaner, and far more dangerous. My stomach dropped. It was the same smoke-glass creature we'd faced in the gulch, only now it wasn't alone. Two more just like it emerged, their bodies shifting and flickering, the air around them warping with heat. She stiffened beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. "Ward," Cobb said, his voice low, "what in God's name are those?" I didn't take my eyes off them. "The end of the line, if we don't stop them here." The creatures began moving forward, their forms flowing like oil over the dirt. Gunfire barely slowed them. Bullets passed through as if hitting mist. I saw her close her eyes, her lips moving in that strange, beautiful language. The disc pulsed again, brighter this time, and a wall of force erupted between us and them. They slammed into it, the street trembling under the impact. Cracks spiderwebbed across the barrier, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. I reloaded, my hands shaking but steady enough to work the action. "When it breaks," I told Cobb, "we hit them with everything we've got." Bullets stitched bright seams through the dust, passing uselessly through smoke glass. The creatures swam forward anyway, dragging the air into ripples as they came. I tasted copper, fear, and grit, and pushed myself into the open street. The alien woman rose beside me, duster flapping, eyes lit like storm glass. She pressed the disc to her chest, and the marks on her arms blazed. Symbols lifted off her skin like fireflies, circling her hands in glowing orbits. She spoke, a low, harmonic chant that made the boardwalk planks hum sympathetically. The nearest creature recoiled, its edges hardening, as if music made it solid. "Hold it there!" I shouted, and Cobb put 3 rounds through its bright core. For once the lead mattered. It fell, shards dissolving into soot against the dust. The other 2 learned quick, splitting wide, flickering to dodge the disc's pulse. One ghosted through the livery door. The horses screamed and kicked the stalls. The second slid low, a dark river hugging the ground toward the saloon. Barrels toppled. Lantern oil bled across boards like a trail begging for fire. I vaulted the trough, rolled, and came up with the Winchester buck to shoulder. A beam from an armored trooper clipped my stirrup, iron hissing into vapor. Avery swore, stepped in front, and blew the trooper off the porch in splinters. "Rope!" I yelled, because every monster has a way it doesn't like. Cobb understood before I finished, tossing me a coil with a gambler's snap. I ran at the saloon thing, feeling stupid, brave, and born of dust water. The rope spun over my head, humming in time with her impossible chant. I dropped the loop. It sank an inch, then caught like lariat on glass. The creature bucked, the rope smoked, hemp screaming, my palms blistering raw. "Now!" I cried, and 3 rifles pinned it while she hammered it with light. The livery erupted, doors blown outward by a pressure I felt in bone, horses bolted, eyes rolling, steam bursting from nostrils like winter in July. The 3rd creature rode that panic, poured itself into the stampede's center line. It leapt, a black ribbon snapping, and sliced a water barrel clean in half. Spray filled the air, glittering, and for a heartbeat it took shape, made visible. I fired into the wet silhouette, lead chewed a hole, and it howled. The sound wasn't a noise, more a memory of fear shoved into our heads. She staggered, blood dark at her nose, but lifted the disc once more. "Stop!" I barked, grabbing her wrist, feeling heat like forge work biting skin. "You'll burn yourself down." She met my eyes and spoke one clear word: trust. The syllable wasn't English, but my bones recognized it just the same. She spun the disc, the symbols reconfigured, the pitch of its pulse dropped. A wave rolled out low, hugging dirt, snagging shadows like burrs on denim. The 3rd creature tried to rise and found itself sewn to Main Street. Armor dropped from the ruined craft. More troopers marched with wasp-loud guns. Town roofs caught beams, shingles jumped, and the church bell rang itself senseless. Cobb rallied the line, voice steady as bedrock, while chaos gnawed the edges. "Pick your shots, sight the joints, keep the street between you and them." His hat blew off. He didn't blink, just shot, reloaded, and shot again. I sprinted for the fallen trooper, tore the humming rifle from dead hands. It kicked different, less recoil, more thunder in the teeth when I squeezed the trigger. The beam lanced clean, carving a smoking path through smoke-glass ribs. The pinned creature shrieked, split, and tried to pour itself between planks. She flung her palm down, boards warped, seams sealing like tar in summer. "Name," I said, crouched beside her, because dying strangers shouldn't stay nameless. She blinked, surprised, then touched my sternum and hers. "Sierra," she said carefully. "Caleb," I answered, and tried to smile while hell rearranged the town around us. "Together," she said, and I didn't need a translator for that particular gospel. Sierra pointed at the sky. The rift widened, bleeding colors without earthly names. Wind screamed down Main as if the heavens were sucking the town upward. If the tear opened fully, dust water would peel off the map like paint. "We close it at the source," she said, pressing the disc hard into my palm. "Key, not weapon. You carry. I guide." Her voice was barely more than ash. Cobb heard enough. "Go!" he barked. "Avery, you're with me. Hold this cursed street." He tipped 2 fingers at his brow. "Bring our sky back, Ward." We ran for the water tower's broken frame, the only height left standing. Stairs, half-torn, sloped like a drunkard's idea of straight. We climbed anyway. Sierra's light traced the handrails, sealing rot, knitting splinters into temporary spine. Below, the town fought like it had a right to keep breathing dust. Above, the rift's edge fluttered like a wounded eyelid, leaking hot aurora. "Center line," she panted. "Cut and suture. You press, I sing." It sounded insane. But insanity was cheaper than surrender, so I braced and lifted the disc. The world throbbed as the disc met the sky, like tuning a giant broken harp. Symbols poured outward, threading into the tear, stitching with light and gravity. Sierra sang, notes sliding between my ribs, telling my heart how to beat. The rift bucked, tried to spit us off the tower like burrs from a dog. I locked elbows, screamed, and pressed harder, feeling bones argue about their duty. Below, beams and bullets braided into a single rope of pure refusal. Dustwater, stubborn, ornery dustwater, held the line while we sowed the heavens. The tear pinched, folded, fought, then slipped like silk under a steady needle. One last convulsion hurled us backward. I caught Sarah, and the disc dimmed. Silence crashed down so fast my ears rang with the absence of thunder. Smoke glass bodies lost their shape, fell as ash, and blew toward the buttes. Troopers faltered, armor dulling. Cobb's line advanced with the confidence of survivors. A final shot, Avery's boom, and the street remembered how to be only dirt. I lay there laughing, crying, and promising to fix every fence I owned. Sierra coughed, smiled, and leaned her forehead to mine, heat gone, pulse steady. "Home?" she asked, and the word carried more miles than the prairie could hold. "Here, if you want it," I said, voice rough, heart loud, hands still shaking. Cobb limped over, hatless, eyes bright with relief. He refused to confess. "Reckon the paperwork for this'll be a nightmare," he said, deadpan and human. I stood, helped Sarah up, and looked at the sky we'd stitched back true. Love, it turns out, can cross a rift if two fools hold the thread. By nightfall, Dustwater looked like a town that had survived the end of the world and decided to keep on living. The air still carried the faint metallic scent of the rift, but the sky above was whole again, just stars, cold and clear. Folks stepped out from behind barricades, blinking like they weren't sure if the danger was truly gone. Cobb was already barking orders about repairs, but there was a softer edge to his voice now, the kind a man gets when he's grateful. Avery offered me a flask without a word, and I took it, the burn in my throat grounding me in the here and now. Sierra stood beside the water tower's remains, her gaze lifted to the constellations. I wondered what world she saw hidden in them, what memories lived beyond our reach. When she turned to me, there was no fear left in her eyes, only a quiet strength that made the worst of the day feel worth it. "Tomorrow?" she asked, and though I didn't know what tomorrow meant for her, I nodded. Because wherever she was going, I'd already decided my boots would be on the trail beside hers. Dustwater would heal, fences would be mended, saloons rebuilt, and stories told over and over until they became legend. They'd speak of the day creatures came from the sky and were met not just with bullets, but with stubborn hearts. And maybe, years from now, someone would ask about the stranger who fought beside me, the one not born of this earth. I'd smile and say what I already knew to be true. Sometimes, love don't care where you come from, so long as you're willing to fight for the same piece of sky.